is 12:30. We're kicking off with the webinar on what is social value and how does it link with schools, suppliers, and supply chains. Welcome everyone to this webinar. Really excited to see you all here and hope you managed to learn something really useful from this and have some clear steps for what to do going forward around social value. Without further ado, let's kick off. So on the agenda today, we'll be covering what is social value, what's the UK government social value model, going into a bit more detail around that, what first steps can both schools and suppliers take, what's the legislation around it and the potential changes that are coming up, especially with the Procurement Act and the new Labour government, and finally, some case studies and time for questions. The case studies include how we've implemented social value delivery through school procurement, through supplier contracting. So just to give a bit of a heads up there in case you're wondering what kind of case studies we're talking about. So just a bit of an introduction to myself before we start. My name is Ewan. I'm lead consultant at Value Match. I lead with the Sustainable Schools Assessment Program, which helps schools to identify their sustainability strategy and their social value strategy. Likewise, I also help suppliers with that, especially those that want to bid into public sector within the UK, as it's a very important area to address to remain competitive in tenders. So that's my main job. If you have any questions or want to get in touch with me, I have a QR code up in the top of the screen, so feel free to get in touch. So I'm just going to pull up my notes on the side here. All right. So kicking off here, what is social value? In order to really figure out how we're going to operationalize and execute social value within procurement, we need to have a clear idea on what it is. So I asked myself, what is social value? And so what I went and did is that I did exactly what I would do if I was trying to find out about what social value is with no knowledge prior. So I went to Google and pulled some different answers for what social value is defined as. And to a degree, it kind of feels like if you ask 10 different people what social value is, you'll get 10 different answers, which is quite challenging. So these are the different definitions that I got from online, from Googling. So social value is a broader understanding of value, and it moves beyond using money as the main indicator of value, and instead puts the emphasis on engaging people to understand the impact of decisions on their lives. Crown Commercial Services says that social value in procurement is about making sure that what we buy creates an overall positive impact on our people and our communities. It can be divided into three main areas: social, economic, and environmental. Executive Compass says that social value is the contribution you make to society, and in particular to your local society and community where you operate. Finally, Social Value International says that social value is about understanding the relative importance that people place on changes to their well-being and using insights that we gain from this understanding to make better decisions. So definitions around social value can be quite confusing at times, as we see, and each person kind of has their own definition of how they phrase it. And the UK government also has had its own history of trying to get started on not only defining it, but enacting it within their public sector procurements. So one of the key first steps in 2013 around this was actually when the Social Value Act, or the Public Services Act 2012, was put in place. This act requires government bodies to think about how they can ensure social value through procurement. However, this act gives no provisions as to what social value actually is in a structured way. It only tells people in public sector procurement to consider it within tenders. To improve on this, this was built upon in 2018 when the government moved forward to making a commitment to explicitly evaluating social value in major contracts. However, defining social value was still a bit vague. One of the major changes in 2020 was following consultation with different departmental, policy, and industrial groups, the UK government released what's called its social value model, which defines a set of priority themes and policy outcomes that are important to government commercial activities. So we'll cover what the social value model is in the next section. So looking at, based on the regulations and everything that's come out, what are the first steps that both suppliers and schools can be taking to address social value within operations and procurement? So going to the social value model, within the model from the UK government is 5 priority themes with model evaluation criteria that is outlined to help procurement professionals quantify them, using KPIs and metrics. While these themes are distinct in themselves, as you can see on screen, they all kind of play into each other and have a lot of overlap. So it still provides much more structured definitions than what would otherwise have not existed in the UK. So going through them on screen really briefly, COVID-19 recovery is to do with helping communities recover socially and economically from the pandemic's effects. So that's, through things like retraining, return to work opportunities, community support, as well as supporting the well-being and health of those affected by the pandemic. Number two, tackling economic inequality. This is mainly to do with trying to develop the UK into a context that's great for business growth. This involves things like developing the skills of the workforce, addressing lack of opportunities, and addressing the development of skills in local areas and helping local communities thrive. The third one, fighting climate change. This is to do with businesses aiding the drive to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the latest 2050 and promoting environmental protection. This is something that we're seeing quite a strong emphasis in public sector procurement and other regulatory areas. Number four, equal opportunities. Sorry. Equal opportunities is mainly to do with the UK government's goals of making the UK's workforce not only high quality in skills, but also diverse in representation. One example is that the government wants to see 1 million more disabled people into work over the next 10 years. And so businesses need to be showcasing how they're going to contribute to these goals. Finally, theme 5, well-being. This is to do with the government wanting employers to be better at supporting employees, especially around areas like mental health issues and to remain in healthy and productive work. Part of this is actually evaluating how many suppliers will implement the 6 standards of mental health at work commitment. So another next step that suppliers and schools can be doing to address social value is really to keep abreast of existing and upcoming legislation and regulations, as this will be important to staying ahead of the game and remaining competitive. So these are on screen are some of the key regulations and guidances to be aware of. With regards to regulations around public sector, suppliers and schools specifically, here are a few things to consider. So a lot of the obligations and goals set out in the Department for Education's Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy, or the DfE strategy, which we've covered before, they're to do with topics that relate to social value, as you can see. So, for example, all new school buildings that the DfE will be delivering have to be net zero in operation. So construction firms will have to play into that. Schools will need to also start sourcing from suppliers that have carbon reduction plans and measures in place. So there's not only pressure on schools to procure from these sustainable businesses, but there's also pressure for businesses to start upping their game when it comes to carbon reduction to be able to match that demand from the government and from the education sector. Additionally, schools, through their procurement, will need to start promoting areas like circular economy, reusable products, and reducing food waste. So other areas also talk about using retrofitting projects as opportunities to educate and build skills within the student base to build up their skills in renewable energy and green technology development. All of these actually relate to social value themes, especially like fighting climate change, equal opportunities, developing the workforce's skills. And suppliers need to really start thinking about how they can add value to schools by addressing social value themes that goes beyond just the delivery of a contract or a project. We need to think about how we can deliver social value as a standard value add through a contract. For suppliers that are supplying or plan to supply to the wider public sector, one thing that's important to know is that according to PPN 0620 procurement policy note, it's important to know that central government bodies have to have a 10% weighting for social value priorities within their tenders as a minimum. Some councils, some public contracting bodies are going up to 15, 20, sometimes even 30% of the weighting. So purchasing teams are also allowed to, once again, they're allowed to go higher on the weighting if they can justify it. And in our experience for supporting with bid reviews in the public sector tenders, we've seen that social value is an area that's increasingly prioritized in tenders from organizations such as Crown Commercial Services. So we often get asked for help on how to respond to these social value questions. And while PPN 0620 was released in September of 2020, almost a year later, in June 2021, PPN 0521 was released, which mandates that public sector contracting bodies have to consider the creation of new businesses, skills and jobs, tackling climate change, and improving supply chain resilience and innovation and diversity through procurement. So suppliers need to be thinking about how they can contribute to that agenda if they're going to stay competitive. So in terms of what we're seeing on the ground, I'd like to go over to our public sector support correspondent, Laura Davies, who is the head of supplier services, to answer a couple of questions on screen. So over to you, Laura. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think interesting area, and there's a lot of, as Ewan started out, there's a lot of different, I think, definitions of social value and what it means. And I think sometimes people get lost in that a little bit. I think what we're seeing in procurements and in bid reviews and different things that we're doing is obviously social value is now more prominent than ever, off the back of the social value model kind of being implemented with that sort of minimum 10%. Interesting, it is a minimum, so people do choose to go higher if they are, developing and putting into place a contract where they see that that is what they want to do, and if it's justifiable and balanced. I think the themes drive more questions, or I think different companies focusing on different areas of the 5 themes. So sometimes people don't ask a question about each theme. They might focus in on the climate and the economic, and that's it. Or some people, if it's an NHS tender, for example, might focus in on COVID-19 recovery. It's variable. But I think it's just important to notice that there is definitely a shift in more questions being asked. The themes are there, the model is there, the weighting is there. So to be able to respond to that in a joined up way is important. And I think just being able to demonstrate for whatever contract you're bidding for, some examples. So they don't have to be social related. You can do things like upskilling employees, team building days, making sure you're recruiting locally, apprenticeship opportunities, making sure you've got CRPs in place, carbon footprint reduction. So, there's a range of things that you can cover in that social value mix. And I think we're seeing questions, covering all of those things. Interestingly, in the NHS, NHS Supply Chain, who are a big framework organisation, put lots of frameworks in place. They have mandatory criteria around carbon reduction planning now, just as one way. So you can't get past initial phases of tenders unless you've got a carbon reduction plan. So that's just one example of a shift. Several years ago, that was not mandatory, but we're seeing that movement towards it. And then I think, sorry, I'm just going to check in on my other question. What steps can suppliers make to ensure they're set up well? I think this is about, really simply reading the questions that you're getting asked, I guess, in tenders, and making sure that you are answering the question. Do your research, research the organisation, the contracting authority, in terms of have they got economic and strategic plans in place with social value built into it, to make sure that you're responding or you're cognizant of that when you're putting your responses together. I think be specific, give commitments, make sure they're tangible, make them kind of real life. We used to see, or I used to see, somebody would respond to a social value question, and it would be quite a vague question, and they might say, oh, we're going to employ local taxi companies in the area. And it's like, okay, well, that's great, but how are you going to track that? How are you going to make sure that happens? So we need some precision around objectives and targets where possible. We're going to commit to doing this, and we're going to reduce this by this, and it's going to be by this date, etc. And obviously that needs to translate into the contract. So understanding what's required of you when you're responding is important, and those commitments. I think they're the sort of key themes that I would pull out. And I think interesting to notice, the biggest shift for me is just is that being able to demonstrate that you can do what you say you're going to do around social value. So you can't just say this is kind of an overview. It's kind of like, this is what we're going to do, these are the actions, this is the impact, and this is how we're going to measure it. I think they're the key things for me. And with the new legislation coming into place, interestingly, in the new Procurement Act, social value isn't mentioned per se, as in using the word social value, which is interesting. So that's a bit of a shift, but I don't think we'll see this change, because the themes that the Social Value Act covers are still important. There are still net zero targets for everybody. So, a lot of this kind of social value coverage and themes will not change. So I don't see it changing much as we move forward. In fact, I think it will get stricter. So that would be my takeaways. Hope
That's
that's
really
helpful.
useful. That's very useful, Laura. Thank you very much for that. I think playing into exactly what you've said, I'm for the next slide, which is about upcoming upcoming legislative changes as well as the new Labour government. There's not really much I'm going to be saying that will be much different from what Laura's also just said. So prior to this webinar, I did some reading up on the Labour's manifesto to see how it may impact social value. And if you go into these documents and do a control F to look for the words social value in the document, you're not going to see those two words mentioned much, if at all. However, the manifesto does emphasize these different areas on screen, such as the push for net zero and clean energy, worker well-being and rights, support for small businesses, and upholding prompt payment, as well as the development of local skills and opportunities. So these are all things that really play into social value. And with the social value model covering these themes and the points from the Labour's manifesto, we don't think social value is really going to go anywhere. To be honest, it's probably going to become even tighter. Much more in detail around what Labour's plans are in the Change Manifesto. There's a strong emphasis on all these areas, certainly. So we don't think it's going to be going away. So when it comes to schools, Labour is also wanting to ensure that all students have 2 weeks worth of work experience made available to them, as well as professional careers guidance. So these are things that can be secured through good contracting, and that suppliers to the education sector should be thinking about how they can deliver that goal of the Labour government. And in light of this, many people also have a lot of questions around what Laura mentioned about the upcoming Procurement Act. In line with the Labour manifesto's points, it's unsurprising that people expect that the Procurement Act under Labour will actually demand more accountability and more ability to demonstrate social value and to make social value more integral to procurement. So this may mean that suppliers wanting to bid into the public sector organizations will need to start being tighter with their KPIs and demonstrating the execution of social value initiatives contracted, and be prepared to answer questions about if they've managed to carry those commitments forward. So in terms of general recommendations around how schools and suppliers can address social value on screen, I've put a few key recommendations as well as which organizations they're most related to. So these are the main recommendations that I'll go through. So have a carbon reduction plan according to the PPN 0621 standard. So as Laura said, many government tenders are asking for carbon reduction strategies and net zero plans, particularly case in point, the NHS. So creating a CRP or carbon reduction plan, creating a carbon reduction plan can actually hit two birds with one stone. It outlines not only your approach, but it also outlines your methodology for how to achieve that carbon reduction. And so doing this can really set you up for greater success in bidding for tenders in the public space. And as the DofE begins to support schools with sustainable procurements and procuring from suppliers committed to net zero and that have plans, having CRPs from a supplier perspective will really help you to be getting in on the first floor, so to speak. Number two, have a clear understanding of what social value goals your organization has and why. So when it comes to social value, a key goal is actually to benefit local communities. So it's actually really important to understand what needs or issues the local community has. This can be areas such as skills development, employment needs, or well-being. So from here, it'll be much easier to develop a targeted approach to driving social value as an organization through your own procurements. Having a clear understanding of what needs there are really helps with implementing things like SMART goals for social value and really helps them become real and actionable. For schools, evaluating how your procurement can be leveraged for social value is also quite important, given that the education sector spends over £10 billion a year on procurement. Imagine what kind of impact we'd have if that money was utilized to drive social value, local economic growth, and climate change prevention measures through supplier commitments. The third tip that I have is record your social value initiatives. So ensure to record impact metrics and information around social value initiatives done. If your company has done things like volunteering or has done any social benefit initiatives, make sure to record metrics related to impact and the stories related to it, as this will really help demonstrate that you have evidence of being a social value focused organization when it comes to bids. Social value initiatives can focus on things like charitable events, apprenticeships, skills, development for local communities, as well as development of skills and career opportunities for students within schools as well. Having stories and metrics of your social value initiatives in the past gives people who are reviewing your bid a much stronger impression that you're able to not only know what you're doing for social value, but able to deliver it and be able to prove results with numbers. It really helps. Finally, consider having a social value policy. Tenders will often ask about companies' approach to different areas, including social value. So having a policy really helps to crystallize your organization's approach, philosophy, and commitment to the topic, and will help you to govern your initiatives going forward. So we think it's very important. In terms of case studies of how we've delivered social value through suppliers and schools in the past, one example is through doing procurement for school uniforms. We were able to implement a secondhand uniform scheme, which essentially means parents that may struggle financially with buying new school uniforms can go through a more sustainable and affordable option. Additionally, factories that made up the supply chain for the uniforms were accredited by SEDEX, meaning they have high ethical, human rights, and environmental standards. So multiple areas and multiple themes of social value are addressed in this case study, such as fighting climate change, equal opportunities, as well as promoting supply chain resilience and innovation through ethical suppliers. Just a reminder, one of our services, when it comes to outlining how to identify social value impact areas and what to do about it, one of the services that we do is the social impact and improvement model assessment. This basically benchmarks your organization's sustainability across multiple areas, including environmental protection, human rights, equality, diversity, and inclusion, resource use and circular economy, social value delivery, and health and well-being. So it really helps to create a holistic strategy and helps organizations to stay ahead of legislative changes and to have a competitive edge in bids. So we've used this model across SMEs as well as all the way to multinational construction companies, and we've had a lot of actionable insights and positive impact through the model and using it to help organizations determine their strategy going forward. Likewise, for schools as well, we have the Sustainable Schools Assessment. We help you to identify your sustainability and social value strategy going forward and what kind of areas you can enact those within procurement as well. And the goal is really to help schools not only steward the environment, but also to strengthen the communities that they're situated within, as well as to safeguard the people that they come into contact with. So if you're interested, please feel free to get in touch. But this brings us to the end of our presentation, brings us to questions and answers. So please feel free to pop into the chat if you have any questions. We're very happy to answer. But thank you very much for coming and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Hi, Ewan. We have a question.
All right.
What are the most common challenges you've seen in supplies when it comes to social value?
Ooh. I think from my perspective, having done social impact and improvement model assessments, I think communicating what social value is and what social value areas are important to a business and communicating it to higher management and to get it operationalized in a business is the thing that I've seen businesses are challenged with, not only small businesses, but also large businesses as well. So I think really having that outside and independent view through things like the SIM assessment are really helpful to getting upper management's buy-in into social value initiatives and the direction moving forward for it. Laura, from a tenders and bid response perspective, what are your thoughts on this?
I think, yeah, you pretty much covered it. I think, I think it's just about, if you're bidding, for example, what is your social value policy strategy? And then what is the organization you're bidding for strategy? And then perhaps trying to align and see where there's kind of synergies. And then obviously in the tender process, it's about answering the question that's asked, which sometimes means that you might not necessarily be able to get everything in because of your word count, word counts and things like that. But I just think it's about just having clear what your strategy is, and then making sure that that's well set out, the impact is there, the measurement, the metrics are there. And I think Karen's just said in the chat, which is a really good point, the more focus on contract management in the new act, procurement act. So metrics, KPIs, measurements, and making sure that things are happening as per the contract and as per what you set out in your tender is going to be even more important. And then Helen, I'm just going to jump on because it kind of runs on to from what I'm saying. You said about a template for creating a social value policy. Yeah, we have various templates and we've done that kind of thing quite a lot. So it's definitely something we can help with. And we very much do that collaboratively with you. So, we understand where you're coming from, what your starting point is, and then we can develop it with you. So yeah, and I think, yeah, sorry, I'm just reading on through the questions just because I can see them, they're right in front of me. Feel free to jump in, you, and if there's anything else I'm missing, but measuring social value is difficult. Obviously, there are various tools out there, and it escapes me. Tom's, sorry, it's just come back to me. I know there's Tom's, there's a couple of other measurements. I think it's more difficult to measure things like that. I think in my mind, the more and I say the word simplistic, but I mean it just in a just logical, simplistic, sensible way is probably always best. I think also it depends with what you're trying to measure, what the social value is that you're trying to put into a contract. But I think there are ways to do it, and there are tools out there that will help. But yes, I agree, it can be more challenging. But I think it goes back to what's your starting point. So what is your strategy, and as an organization, what do you feel strongly about? What is your social value strategy? And then that's a good starting point to then think, right, well, actually in this contract we could probably do X, Y, and Z. And then naturally, hopefully, how you measure it and how you kind of want to implement it should flow.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on Helen's question as well around a template for creating social value policy for trust. This is something that we've done in the past and we've supported a trust with before. The approach that we try to take to it is we try to map the policy as closely as possible to the social value model, not only from a perspective of if someone asks for your social value policy and how does it contribute to the UK government's goals, it's laid out in no uncertain terms what themes you're covering. But in addition, it also gives a really structured way for what social value is. Like if you ask someone, how do you benefit the community? It's quite a vague question, but if you ask someone specifically, how are you fighting and tackling climate change? That's much more specific. That links in the social value. So that's one way that we feel has been most helpful. But obviously, every trust is quite different. So please feel free to get in touch with us to have a chat. We're very happy to chat with you and see how we could be of most help to you.
We have another question.
All right.
If schools aren't organisations that have to demonstrate social value like suppliers do, why should schools be concerned about it?
Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time, please, Brian?
If schools aren't organisations that have to demonstrate social value like suppliers do, why should schools be concerned about it?
That's a really interesting question. So while suppliers have to care about social value from the perspective of bidding into public sector, I believe schools need to care about social value from a perspective of compliance with likely upcoming government regulations. So particularly the Department for Education Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy, or we'll just call it the DAB strategy for short because it's so long. The DAB strategy outlines that schools will need to start factoring in for sustainable, circular, and reduced waste within procurement. And they're also, once again, they're going to be supporting schools in doing this. Additionally, there's also outlines around having schools mandatory requirements around food reporting, carbon emissions around food, the impact of that, and reporting and being transparent around that. So if you have to be transparent and report on the impact on environment that your school has, naturally you're going to have to keep track of how that's doing in procurement. So whilst in social value regulations, schools aren't directly addressed, surrounding regulations pretty much allude that schools need to be concerned about this as well. So I hope that answers the question.
How can schools take their first steps to their social value journey?
I think much like suppliers, gauging what the needs are and what the issues are facing a school's local community will be quite important. There's no point giving a solution where there's no problem existing. So I think that's a really good first step. I think also one of the things that we do at Value Match is a commercial discovery, which looks at the efficiency of your procurement, where the money is going, what the potential impact is, and the level of compliance. That's also one really important first step to address, because the amount of money that schools spend is quite a lot, and a lot of it could be mobilized for social value and social benefit if it's done properly, compliantly, and contracted. So I think those are two very important first steps: understanding the needs of the community, what strengths your school has, and how you could leverage your procurement for it. That's something that we address through not only the sustainable schools assessment, which I mentioned before, but also the commercial discovery. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Laura?
No, that's great. I just yeah, so I think the point around the locality of the school and the kind of needs is really important, because obviously, there's multi-academy trusts and schools all over the country, and they'll all have different relevant pushes and pull factors kind of, in their local communities and within their schools and trusts. So I think it's understanding that, which goes back to the point of, if you've got that social value strategy, then that's the kind of starting point. Also, as you mentioned, the sustainable schools assessment that we do, that really kind of gives a good baseline across 6 key areas, all linked to sustainability, carbon, circular, health and wellbeing, diversity, all those things. So that's a really good way of kind of going, taking stock and sort of saying, right, well, where am I as a multi-academy trust, or as a school, or as an organization, relevant of organization. And then how can I look to build on what I've got in place? Actually, what I've got in place might be really good, and I might not need to do a huge amount, or it might just identify some really quick wins, or it might identify that you kind of, you're kind of starting from scratch, or and there's a lot of work to do, and then it's about prioritizing, and we can help with that. Our assessment helps you to understand how to prioritize and work with you and give you that sort of roadmap journey to push on and try and get some of those things in place.
Good. Thanks, Laura.
We have one final question. With social value being such a wide-ranging topic, how do small suppliers figure out where to focus first?
That's a very good question. I think because every business is different, not only in terms of like their size, the makeup of their employees, the makeup of the customers that they serve, and additionally the business goals for growth and market expansion that they want. I think in terms of first steps for understanding what kind of impact or what social value areas are important to them, it's important to do a bird's eye view assessment of all those different factors I mentioned before. So something like what I mentioned before, the social impact and improvement model assessment, that's something that's really useful. I think why it benefits quite a lot is that when you're working in an organization yourself, it's quite hard to see the forest from the trees when it comes to all these different factors that make up the uniqueness and strengths and weaknesses of your business. So something like us coming and helping you with a social impact and improvement model assessment really helps to get that bird's eye view, look at what areas you can just focus on compliance in, and look at what areas you could excel in sustainability and drive best practice forward. So if you're interested in any of that, please feel free to get in touch. Very happy to help. But yeah, that's what I'd say is probably the useful first step. All right.
I think that's all the questions, Ewan.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you everyone for coming. Hope it's been useful. And if you have any other further questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. My contact details were put on the slides, which we'll be sending out later. And hope you all have a good day and a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.